Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode. Today we're going to be discussing access, creating good access on your property, what to look for on your farm before implementing things like food plots like we're in right now. You definitely want to plan all this stuff out ahead. You want to be looking for travel routes, transition areas, and things like that before you start implementing food plots, and definitely before you ever put a deer stand on your farm. So let's dive on in on creating good access, and you will learn along the way how to set up a farm and how we set up our property and how we set up properties for our clients as well. So the first thing I look for is I'm going to be looking for edges, borders, roads, could be creek crossings. I'm going to be looking for anything that could be like a barrier or could be some sort of block in a deer's movement from point A to point B. So that being said, this food plot, why we designed it, why it's in this location, is it's close to a road. It's pretty easy access getting into my deer stand. I don't have to worry about bumping a lot of deer, but deer do move north and south through this food source, and I just hunt parallel to this food plot on the downwind side. I use some sort of like west, northwest wind. West is blowing away from this food plot, blowing in that direction. It's actually blowing over the road. So when creating good access on your farm, when creating good food plots on your property, you need to be looking for roadblocks, barriers, things that make deer not want to travel in that direction, or at least not want to travel in that direction until nighttime. So I know they'll cross this road, no big deal, out into the ag field, but they typically wait till the nighttime to do it. So this sets this up for a really good staging area. If does are bedding up on this hillside here, or even say a buck during the rut, scent checking does, and he's coming down on this downwind side of that doe bedding area, and he's coming through this food plot to scent check that bedding area, that's going to set me up really good on this side with that west wind, northwest wind blowing this direction. He's going to be kind of using it to go back up the hill, and I'm going to be on the downwind side of him. So what I'm doing is I'm using the road, knowing that they're likely not going to cross that till night. That allows me to come across there, not have to bump any deer out of their beds, not bump any deer off the main trail, and not be pushing my wind up into this doe bedding area. So I'm going to be looking for multiple areas like that on this farm. And what I'm doing is when I'm mapping out a property, I'm looking at the overall timber, and I'm looking for all the edges, all the corners, all the ways to access that property without getting in too deep and pushing deer. But it still needs to be a high odds area. We got timber ponds, we got oak flats, we got tons of ridges, tons of pinch points, creek crossings, many other areas on this farm that we're going to be hunting. But what I do is I like to layer the whole farm. So I start on the outside, early October, and then I slowly work my way in all the way to about November 1st, November 2nd. Pre-rut for us is typically October 26th, right in there, and that goes on through November. So I'll start pushing in from about October 26th all the way through November, and even on into late season. And then typically during late season, I'll kind of start to work my way back out to the food sources. But what I'm going to be looking for on any given property is all the edges, all the barriers, all the roads, all the easy access, and then from there you can kind of work your way in. I don't want to push in on a farm 200-300 yards and then go like, well, this would be a good spot, it's nice and open, let's put a food plot here. When you probably had many other better locations for a food source, it just wasn't ideal because there was a lot of timber cutting or a lot of work to do. And I see that oftentimes where you'll just create a food source in an area that's very easy versus a really good high odds area to hunt. This here, this food source, this is less than 1/8 of an acre, but it was pure timber. This was all timber in here. We cut down about 10 trees, and it was a lot of work. But if you're not against running a chainsaw and cutting some timber and clearing out an area that's in a high odds area like this, I highly recommend it because it will pay off. So what's the next thing we're looking for when designing a property and when looking for good access? I want to figure out where I can blow my wind as much as I want to figure out where the deer are traveling. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I always need to be on the direct downwind side either. I don't mind giving them a little bit of my wind. I always try to just split hairs. I try to just put myself just on the edge of getting busted. So with this food source, we're doing the same thing. Right behind me, this would be a north wind coming this direction. And a lot of times the big bucks will come right behind where I'm standing here, and they'll come right through this food source. So with the northwest, it's blowing kind of towards them, but that westerly is pushing it out towards the road, allowing me to kind of just split hairs. Now I have had them get around me. Big bucks are always trying to get on the downwind side. But that being said, that doesn't mean that they're trying to get on the downwind side using it straight in their face. I've seen deer use the wind to their back, their sides, they're constantly changing depending on topography, what kind of ridges, what barriers, and during the rut, we all know that sometimes they just kind of throw caution in the wind a little bit. Maybe not entirely, but a little bit. So whenever I'm designing a farm and I'm looking for good access, once I've marked out all these areas, once I've marked out the roads, even if it's property line doesn't necessarily mean that that's the border of where I think they're traveling, so I don't pay as much attention to that. I'm looking for a border of where the deer's traveling. If there's a cliff ridge that I know there's no way in heck they're going off of that to me, that's another barrier. So I might want to set up on that ridge with my wind blowing off that, and say the travel route is right along that ridge, I can still get away with that, and it creates a high odds area for those deer to travel through there, because I already know they're trying to stay on the edge of the property as they travel these things. That's just typically what ends up happening, or at least what I see with mature bucks, is that they're constantly walking the edge of everything. So once you put yourself way too far into the farm, it might look like a good area, it might have tons of rubs from previous rut, it might have tons of scrapes, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the highest odds spot. Could be, but I want to start on the edge and I want to work my way all the way up to that. So then that way I'm not coming in here October 5th, 6th, say it's 75 degrees, it's warm, bucks are moving 30 yards in daylight at best, 50 yards, and I'm just blowing them all out. I want to start here. Maybe I hunt this food plot once, twice, I don't connect with one, I wait for that big temperature swing, that 20-degree temperature swing, and then I have another set, maybe a cell cam running, and then I push into that next area. But you always want to be kind of doing it in layers. You want to start from the edge and you want to work your way in, and you never want to push in too deep, too fast. That's going to take away from that really good access. So once you've figured out where your food plots need to be, where all your edges are, where the transition routes, the travel routes are, just build yourself a layering system from October through December and slowly dissect that farm and move in as the season progresses and as the daylight sightings get better. Not just push all the way in right off the bat and you end up bumping a deer or not seeing a deer, or just leaving too much scent because you're walking from the road 200 yards in, you're leaving that night, you're walking 200 yards back out, you're blowing deer out of every which direction. It just is not good access. It's not a good strategy for hunting. So once you've figured out kind of how these deer operate, and you'll notice it'll get better each season as you start to slow yourself down, as you start to look for more sign, as you start to kind of pay attention. Instead of going that 100 yards in, say you only go 50 yards in and you set up that evening, and boom, you end up seeing a 2 or 3 year old. Maybe it's not the big mature buck you're after, but you see that 3-year-old that normally you're not seeing do something, he comes through there. You can learn from that. I've always noticed that if I kind of slow myself down a little bit, not be so reserved that I'm not in the game, but slow myself down just a little bit until season progresses, I end up seeing a lot more daylight sightings and I end up seeing a lot more big bucks. And then by the time season's really heating up and I get in these areas that I want to be in, since I stayed out of them all the way until maybe October 26th, 27th, then my hunts really get good. And that's a good way to capitalize on a mature buck. So guys, I hope this makes sense to you. Access, access, access. That is the most important thing when designing a farm, when hunting a farm. Could even be public ground. I always look for access, and then I always work my way in, and I'm looking for sign, and I'm usually keeping a log of everything every season. And traditionally, you'll see deer do the same thing over and over. Maybe not the same buck, maybe not the same age class, maybe not even the same trail, but something similar to it around the same dates every year. You keep a log of that, and then say, this deer season, October 24th, we get that big temperature swing. Might be 2 days earlier than what I saw him do last year, but we got the temperature for him to move. Instead of 30 yards, maybe he moved 80 yards in daylight, and that's enough to capitalize on him. So thanks again for tuning in on this week's episode, guys. We'll see you next week.